which means that it's my job to manage all of our strategic litigation through which we challenge and influence legislation, policy and corporate actions that are damaging the natural world, biodiversity and rewilding efforts. I'm also responsible for managing our wider non-contentious legal projects, which look to support rewilding through legal education and the use of land protection mechanisms. We'll be hearing from Scott this afternoon a bit more about one of our key bits of litigation recently, which has been on which we collaborated with Trees for Life and which challenged the current approach to beaver culling in Scotland. For those of you who haven't attended one of our webinars before, or who haven't really heard much about Lifescape, we are a UK rewilding charity. Our vision is the creation of a world rich in wild landscapes, providing a sustainable future for life on Earth. And as a charity, we work to achieve this by catalysing the creation, restoration and protection of wild landscapes by pursuing projects which utilise multidisciplinary skills across science, technology, law, economics and culture. If you'd like to know more about our work, please have a look at our website and follow us on social media to keep up to date with our current projects. I'm delighted to be joined today by three fantastic panellists: Alan McDonnell of Trees for Life, Heather Devey from the Cumbria Beaver Group and advocate Scott Blair. I'll introduce each of them properly before they speak. We should have plenty of time at the end of the session today for discussion, and we'd love to get your questions for the panellists. So please just type them in the Q&A box and we'll pick them up at the end. So today's session is going to be kicked off by Alan. He's going to start the session by telling us about beavers in the past and present across Europe and their role as a keystone species fundamental to rewilding. Alan is Trees for Life's conservation manager and he oversees the charity's project work. His role includes a range of rewilding activities such as Caledonian pinewood management, red squirrel translocation and landscape scale collaboration. Recently, he led Trees for Life's efforts to influence the Scottish Government's approach to beaver management via the judicial review, which I mentioned earlier. And prior to working with Trees for Life, Alan worked for Scottish Natural Heritage in the Argyll Islands, Loch Lomond and the Trossachs, leading a regional national nature reserves team, and he was involved in issues such as peatlands, deer management and native woodland restoration. So over to you, Alan.
Thanks so much, Elsie, and hi everybody. Elsie's asked me today just to do a bit of scene setting, set some of the context, so I've got the kind of the basic deal of what beavers are, where they've been, where they're at now, what all the fuss is about, why all the hoo-ha, and how might we coexist with them going forward, offering a view on that. So I'm going to try and rattle through that. Apologies to anyone for whom this is a wee bit basic, but I'll sort of try and get the basic bits as quick as possible. Can the first slide please, Nikita? So just in terms of what a beaver is, it's the third largest rodent, Eurasian beaver, the third largest rodent species in the world after the Canadian beaver and the capybara. They're about 25 kilograms. They're purely vegetarian. They're mostly eating soft aquatic plants in the summer. They'll move on to eating woodier things as that kind of material becomes less available. But of course, you see there those kind of orangey teeth are partly made of iron, and so and they're continually growing. So beavers will also be active in kind of keeping them trimmed on harder wood as well, which is why they have part of why they have such an impact on riparian trees. That wee tail that they have, that big tail, is part of their fat store for winter, and they use that to brace when they're sawing down trees. They use it to communicate when they're warding off predators to try and intimidate other animals, or indeed us if we get too close. And it's a key part of their fat supply through the winter. Beavers live about kind of between 8 and 14 years if they're really long lived, and they live in family units of about four to six animals. The kits that are born 1 year will stay with their parents until most of the way through the next year. So the family size kind of comes and goes a little, but usually a pair of beavers will have at least some kits with them, and probably some yearlings as well that are moving on, and that influences a bit how they move through their territory. They are very territorial, and they'll disperse as they get to maturity. In that second year, they'll start to disperse across the landscape, look for new territories, and their progress of that will just depend a bit on the habitat around them, what's available. and it's a rich, dense area with lots of food availability and good riparian vegetation, then they can be quite dense, and they have a territory just might only be a kilometre apart, but sometimes that might spread up to much longer, maybe 7 kilometres or more. And they'll defend that territory aggressively as a family unit. So actually, beaver on beaver killing is one of the causes of beaver mortality. But along with disease, flooding, road traffic, these are some of the things that kill most beavers. So that very quick run through in terms of what a beaver is. Hopefully, it goes without saying, or I think it goes without saying, they're extremely aquatic animals. They'll spend most of their life within 20 meters of water, and that's a key aspect of how the beaver interacts with our environment and of course with us. Next slide, please, Nikita. So in terms of what a beaver, that's a strange title I put on that slide. In terms of where the beavers have been, this is historically what fossil evidence tells us about the distribution of beavers right across Europe. So pretty much everywhere. From my point of view, frustratingly, no fossil evidence has been found in Ireland yet. But we'll hopefully keep working on that over there. I should say these maps have been put together by Duncan Halley and others. Duncan he's a Norwegian citizen from Dundee, and he's done a lot of research on beavers for last 30 years and more. So he's kind of compiled these maps and tracked them through. But that was the original extent of the Eurasian beaver after the ice melted last time around. Next slide, please, Nikita. And by the late 1800s, this is where we got to. So we've seen a decline in the beaver population for that huge expanse right across Europe and part of Asia, down to maybe as few as 1,200 animals. Just a massive decline, which mirrors actually what happened in North America as well, where some figures are estimating there were 60 million beavers there. And by the 19th century, they were maybe down to as few as 100,000. So we see these massive declines for both of the species of beaver in the world through the 19th century, and most of that was down to hunting for their fur, for their castoreum, this kind of valuable scent gland that was used in perfumes, and for their meat. Some civilizations, some cultures used them for tools as well, used beaver teeth as tools because they were so hard. So there was still a lot of that kind of hunting really decimated these populations, and the beaver was therefore one of the species that kind of inspired the earliest conservation movements, because cultures had long valued beavers, and so when they'd seen these huge declines, people started to want to do something about that. And I guess this kind of just before John Muir became a thing in America, but that kind of the American decline and the American reaction to that happened before the European one, and so it's kind of interesting how the beavers become a bit of a totem for conservation going forward, has inspired that from the very early days before modern conservation as we now know it. Next slide, Nikita. So by last year, this is very roughly where we got to. You see the black blobs here are they're the remnant populations that we had, and all of those beavers across that red zone there have been reintroduced from animals originally captured from these locations, these populations. So clearly there's a genetic bottleneck issue there, but nevertheless we've seen this recovery in terms of the distribution, and that's entirely down to humans reintroducing beavers to 27 countries and more now actually since the early 20th century. So some of the first reintroductions were in Czechoslovakia actually, and then it was reintroduced actually to try and bring an economic asset back into that country. So they're thinking there about fur and meat a wee bit as well. And then then things started to become more conservation motivated. So from the 50s onwards, Germany, France, Holland, again to Czechoslovakia, thinking about let's have the beavers back here for I guess more for their just for their conservation value as a species. They wanted that back. And then since then, particularly since the 90s, people have been a bit more aware of ecosystem services, how the beaver reacts to that, and that's become more of a motive going forward. And even very recently, further out in Asia, Mongolia, for instance, beavers were introduced in the 2010s. entirely to, well, heavily motivated by restoring groundwater resources there and trying to hold water in the landscape. So we know the estimates, and obviously these are very rough, but they're estimated to be about 1.4 million Eurasian beavers in the world, about half of which are in Russia. So that just speaks a bit to the recovery. Next slide, please, Nikita. So what's all the fuss about? There are important things to talk about in terms of what beavers, what have beavers ever done for us? Why should we care about it? And there are, of course, there are good and bad sides to that. So to take the good first, there are a lot of this is around wetland formation, how they affect the landscape, how they change the landscape, and what that does for us. So as beavers come into the landscape, one of the first things they start to do, and their behaviour starts to do, particularly through damming, but also through the way they affect riverbanks, start to trap sediment. And that starts to create a bit of diversity and varying structures in the channel, in river channels and in river banks. That lifts the water table often and creates more storage capacity for water. So that helps with two things. Helps inhibit flooding because when rainfall event happens, the land can sponge up, can soak up more water and prevents these peaks of floods that will flood land around us. But also, and this is particularly pertinent and becoming more pertinent as climate change kicks in Europe, they drought proof as well. So these habitats, these areas will hold water through the summer and reduce the extent to which they drought. That can be ecologically significant, can also be significant for land use as well. Beaver ponds of ecological importance for instance, for fish. They provide good protection for fish from predators. They tend to be too shallow for divers who might go prey on fish, but also too deep for say a shallow wader like a heron. So they can be good refugia for fish populations and for amphibians as well. And they increase the complexity of the shoreline, so and that has an impact on the course and the speed of water flow. So then that starts to, you see the meanders developing there, and that again starts to introduce diversity, habitat diversity into river systems, and that has kick-on benefits for species there. And then the vegetation we get with that starts to become more complex. So we start to see the whole system evolve, more organic matters stored there. We get more timber. And so we start to see a carbon buildup as well, often associated with these systems. There's a wee asterisk on that one, that carbon storage is an extremely complex area, so it's not quite as simple as that. But on balance, the storage of organic matter, the increase of anaerobic storage of that, so underwater storage, will build up carbon. Next slide, please, Nikita. So this is just showing a couple of examples. This is research taken from the River Otter in Devon. So it's the trial that happened down there, and Exeter University led on some of this really good work, which just gives the quantitative example of the impacts beavers have on in this case on hydrology. So you see there, this is just over a 24-hour time frame, and in the part of the catchment above the Beaver Dam, there's a rainfall event. You see kind of the rainfall there. That quickly leads on to a spike in the water level in the channel, and therefore that part of the channel flooded. Whereas further down and below the Beaver Dam, you see a much smoother curve. So whilst the water level climbed, it didn't climb and spike as much, and that's what we mean by flood inhibition. So you get the same amount of water ends up in the system, but it's held back, so it doesn't overwhelm one part of that channel at once, and that's how we inhibit flooding. Where we have beaver dams. Next slide, please, Nikita. Water quality is another issue that beavers help with, and this slide shows it really well. Again, Exeter University's work. So above the dam, suspended sediment through the water, kind of muddying that water, and that kind of clouds it for our interests in terms of the quality of that water, but also for wildlife as well. But again, this is all about the impact of dams. Below beaver dams, those dams themselves will act as filters, and they'll create ponds in which sediment settles, and so we get clear water there. And that can help with a range of things, including in where we have diffuse pollution in catchments, so that kind of pollution will settle in with that sediment. Next slide, please. So this is some of those effects are particularly relevant for fish populations, some are valued fish populations. We get cleaner. The slide on the picture on the left there is just showing a typical kind of spawning bed for say salmon, trout. It's clean. It's not muddy. It's a more receptive habitat for them to lay eggs in, and for those eggs to spawn, become fry and par, and so that it just creates a better, richer, cleaner, healthier environment for our fish populations to live with. So we'll get this kind of the in-stream value and effect of this sort of beaver filtration is valued. Next slide, please. And then that can start, all of those effects I'm talking about can start an ecological cascade effect. And a lot can kind of be stimulated by the diversity that the beavers can start to introduce to the landscape. So you get more plant life on the bank, and that gets more diverse, and the water margins and the aquatic plants are also more diverse. And we get a response to that in, next slide please, Nikita, in the insect life. So we have a whole host of species coming through. We're getting midges, water boatmen, mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, damselflies, butterflies, moths, both in the channel and on the riverbank. Just the response that it gets to that vegetation, the variation in conditions can be really very significant. Next slide, please, Nikita. So when we've got that insect fauna available, that can be a key source of food for amphibians, frogs, toads, newts. Next slide, please. And then both that insect life can be really also equally important for fish populations, eels, lampreys, trout, stickleback, salmon. They'll all profit from that greater availability of food, and as well from the shelter and the varying heat conditions that riparian woodland can create. So we've got cooler water, and at a time a lot of our fish populations and streams are suffering from warming to actually quite a worrying effect. So anything that stimulates riparian growth and shading is a value for fish populations. Next slide, please. And this also pays through into our mammal fauna. So we have plant availability for herbivores like water vole, or insect availability for species like bats, or small mammals available to predators like otter under conditions. All just sort of feed through, so we can get a whole range of wildlife then start to be associated with this richer river that aren't just in the channel itself, but start to come back from the banks, and these species will wander a bit further from the banks. So again, this kind of riparian development, this in-river development, can start to feed out wider across the land. And then next slide, please, Nikita. More predators. So that's just talking about how when we have more mammals active, then pine martens and predatory species will then start to prey on them. That's building that another trophic level into our ecological cascade. Next slide, please. And birds do great with it as well. So they've got more insects available. They've got more sheltering and better habitat available. So our songbirds, birds that prey on fish like heron and osprey, kingfisher, birds of prey that will feed on them, diving birds like little grebes, and ducks like goosander's. It feeds in right into our aerial species too. Next slide, please, Nikita. And the next one. So on the downsides, one of the reasons I think we hear so much about beavers is that it's not all good news. There are clear impacts on farmland, and in Scotland that's been really quite that's been very difficult and led to conflict, because beavers have arrived in one of the richest parts of Scotland in farming terms. They arrived without farmers' knowledge, and they've gradually begun to have an impact on part of the Tayside catchment. So we're looking here at the flooding of crops, which means financial losses for farmers. They undermine banks, so if they're digging lodges into sandy banks, then that can wipe out quite a lot of topsoil. So there are significant losses suffered by some farmers because of the presence of beavers. They'll block culverts, and others have kind of objected to the way beavers affect the landscape and introduce change to the landscape. And I think because this was done without prior consultation, then part of the human response to that has been understandably angry. And so whilst we do see real prospect for coexistence, we need to work through a period of, I think those of us who are representing beaver conservation and beaver interests need to earn a bit of trust there, and to face the challenges today and actually try to open the channels where we can work together with farmers to get to a future. We think there's real prospects there for mutually beneficial relationships, but they need to we just need a bit of time to get them together and hopefully get the relationships right. Next slide, please, Nikita. Some of what that looks like is about looking at our riverbanks, and what I said at the start of this presentation about how beavers will spend most of their lives within 20 meters of a river. We need to look at that 20 meter or any part of the riverbank that we can to reduce the extent to which beavers and land use conflict. Big part of our inspiration for this is from Bavaria. Next slide, please, Nikita. Where they've gone through, in the 80s and 90s, they went through a really bitter beaver conflict with some of the richest arable land in Europe. And a beaver population arrived there and created havoc. And there was a lot of bitterness. But they've kind of given us a bit of a map here to move forward with. Part of what they have done in Bavaria is to preserve some of the riparian zone for beavers. So take that out of production to recognise the effects of that, the economic effects of that with farmers, and just remove that really intense conflict zone. And that one step has done a huge amount to reduce the frequency at which beaver conflicts occur. The second thing they did is they introduced a management system that was responsive. So when farmers had problems, there were quick and effective answers coming through, and they looked at some of the mitigation techniques that we're becoming familiar with on Tayside about removing dams or installing flow devices, which are clever ways of mitigating the effects of what beavers do to the landscape. But also where necessary, removing beavers. And at first in Bavaria, they trapped and removed beavers to other parts of Bavaria where they weren't going to have these kinds of impacts on arable land. And that's something we believe we should absolutely be doing in Scotland. And then as there comes a point where you run out of land to trap, or sorry, land to move beavers to. And at that stage, the Bavarians were very pragmatic about, well, we need to dispatch these beavers. And now Bavaria are trapping and dispatching over 1,000 beavers a year because they've run out of land to move them to. All of that has led to a very different relationship there now than they had 15 years ago. So people are seeing and understanding how beavers are preventing flooding and really appreciating that. There are times that I've seen where we've saved a huge amount of expense on flood protection measures, simply because the beavers are there. And because there's much less conflict and much less economic impact on farmers, the relationship there is actually completely different. And so I think that's very much within our gift for Scotland. And we hope to be able to provide and apply that kind of solution here. And we hope that the government will help us move towards that going forward. That's my rattle through, Elsie. Hope that was sharpened for you.
Excellent, thank you so much, Alan. It's brilliant to sort of hear some of the basic facts about beavers and also hear a bit more about their history. We're going to hear from Heather next. Heather is going to tell us about her work as the project officer for the Cumbria Beaver Group, which is a multi-partner initiative to offer advice, education and support for beaver reintroductions in the region. And following the release of a pair of beavers into an enclosure on the Lyther estate in summer 2020, Heather's created online opportunities to engage thousands of people across Cumbria and beyond with the county's newest residents. She also directs or co-directs Wild Intrigue CIC, which is an ecotourism social enterprise which is coordinating the community consultation for wild Ennerdale's anticipated reintroduction in the Lake District as well. And Heather also works as a visitor development officer for the RSPB at Haweswater in the Lake District. So Heather, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Elsie. Hello, everybody. It's nice that you could all join us today. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm Heather, project officer for the Cumbria Beaver Group, which is quite a new group, admittedly. As Elsie mentioned, we only introduced our first beavers last year. So the main partners of the group are the RSPB, Cumbria Wildlife Trust, Eden Rivers Trust, and the Lowther Estate. But obviously with these things, we work with United Utilities, which is the local water company, Forestry England, the University of Cumbria, Natural England, lots of other stakeholder groups. So my role, basically, it's been a 1 day a week role, and it ends this year. It's basically been to engage the community and introduce them to beavers, which have been an entirely new species for everybody to kind of wrap their heads around and hopefully prepare for their wider reintroduction into the wild, hopefully in the not too distant future. Next slide, please. So in January last year, the Lowther Estate, which is on the eastern edge of the Lake District National Park near Penrith, if anybody knows that area well, they were approved a licence for an enclosed trial reintroduction of beavers into a 27-acre enclosure. So as with most sites in England, it's a small enclosure for beavers to be put into. It passes the feasibility studies and all of that, but it is a small enclosure, but that's what we're kind of having to work with on in England, in the scope of England currently. So we started the community consultation in January, and of course, COVID hit in March. So we managed to get one group out in person to see the site and to just start those discussions. But then when COVID hit, we had to stop everything, and that kind of halted the reintroduction of beavers into the enclosure as well. When the beavers were introduced, that was in summer. So we had a male Glen and a female Dragonfly, already named, we didn't name them, introduced to the enclosure, and they came from Scotland, of course. Our beavers in England are coming from the Scotland stock, as opposed to translocating them throughout Scotland, of course, as Alan's touched on. A lot of them have been moved into England. So I'll talk about the consultation soon, but if we could go to the next slide, please. So the estate itself, it's got a small area of woodland, which is semi kind of wet native woodland. The rest of it is dry. And the other half of the site that you can just see here was once a sheep grazed field. So Lowther Estate are rewilding their entire site, and the beavers they see as one aspect of this. So between the field and the woodland, there's a very, very thin drainage ditch. And that was all that was there before the beavers arrived. So they had to create this pond because beavers need a depth of water, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, around 1 meter's depth to feel secure. And they had to build, you can just see on the left there, that pile of sticks, build a temporary lodge, which was just essentially hay bales with some corrugated sheeting on top and some willow around it. The beavers have done some home renovations there, so they're quite happy with it, thankfully, and they are settling in well. So if we go to the next slide, please. So when they first arrived, it was September that they first arrived. They got to work straight away, felling or coppicing a lot of the larger trees in order to create dams on that very small drainage ditch and to enhance their lodge on the pool. And it didn't take them long at all. So if we go to the next slide, this was the image on the left, sorry, it was 2 weeks after they arrived. That's the same tree. So they really got to work as a pair, felling and coppicing the trees in the immediate surrounding area. And now, the picture on the right there, this was taken in June. We're getting all of that beautiful fresh shrubby regrowth already starting to occur in the woodland. Admittedly, it's going to be quite hard to actually identify many of the changes in the woodland with regards to vegetation because it's already been quite heavily coppiced in the past, but we will still see some changes with regards to the wetland. Next slide, please. Again, they were coppicing primarily hazel, aspen, willow, some alder and birch as well. Next slide. And that has started to regrow already. So when we're bringing groups in, we're finally able to bring groups into the enclosure now, seeing this for themselves. The groups being able to see this regrowth for themselves away from a screen has been really impactful. You can tell them all you like about what is happening in the enclosure on a screen, but to bring them out in person is proven to be incredibly valuable. So we're really pleased to get back to that. Next slide, please. When they were introduced, this section of the woodland was completely dry. This was the wettest it had been, believe it or not. And next slide. A month after the beavers arrived, we had some heavy rain, and they held all of that water back, you know, as they do. They got to work creating a series of dams along that drainage ditch, and they just pushed that water right back into the woodland. And because of that, next slide, please, they needed to channel more areas. They wanted to stretch further out into the woodland. So this is all channels created by the beavers that you can see, with very small dams that you can just see. Next slide, please. And yes, every time we go now, we're discovering new dams that they're making. So the water level has raised significantly in the woodland itself. Next slide, please. But also along the main dam. So the main dam is admittedly quite humble compared to other sites. Not dissing them at all. They've done a very good job, but it is still very humble. So this was 2 weeks after they arrived. Next slide. And then this was 2 months after. So in response to the rain, they increased the height of the dam and they increased the length of the dam. And they've continued that. It's stretching further and further out into the woodland itself. And already we're starting to notice, so we've had quite serious drought in Cumbria. When I went there during that drought, quite a lot of other farmed landscapes, unfortunately, were suffering with lack of water for the livestock. But in the beaver pools, there was still this depth of water. And that's just a great example, again, to bring the community out and show that even on a really small scale, it's just 2 beavers and it's just, you know, a series of 4 dams on this stretch. It just shows the impacts that they could have if they were to be on a catchment scale in our tributaries, the impact that they actually store water for livestock. Next slide, please. So this is behind the dam, and what they've been doing, they've been pushing the water. So if you imagine where you are sitting at home, they've been pushing the water towards where you are, and behind you is the floodplain. So they've created a channel out into the floodplain. Next slide, please. Which is being monitored by the University of Lancaster. Next slide. Yep, they're also monitoring the flow of the water compared to before the beavers arriving and after they leave the site. Next slide. Next slide. And it's been flushed out onto this floodplain. So this was taken a couple of months ago now, but since I took this photo, the beavers have actually created a whole series of channels in the floodplain itself. And it's quite interesting because they've gone away from the woodland now. So they've got the security of the woodland, but they're obviously feeling quite secure in this floodplain area. It's very exposed. They've been channeling out. There's just a few willows there to feel secure, which is very few and far between. But what's been brilliant about this is we've had lapwing return to the site. So we've had 2 pairs that have both successfully raised broods in the enclosure this year. And we've had curlew as well, which is a major improvement for this particular area. We've had one family raise broods. We've had grey lag geese come onto the site. Red shank popped by as well. We've had snipe, flocks of snipe coming in, and a barn owl as well has started foraging, which my colleague at the RSPB is very excited about. It started foraging in the area, and apparently he's worked there for 20 years now. It's the first time he's seen it. So whether there's a correlation there or he's been very optimistic, we're still trying to figure that out. But next slide, please. And of course, we've noticed signs of amphibians returning to the site. So we had our first frog spawn and a very small amount of toad spawn as well in one of the pools. And they have all hatched successfully, and they're all froglets now, hopping around, which again has attracted herons and lots of other species to come in and feed on them. As Alan was talking about, it's just that baseline food source that the beavers help to create. We're just starting to figure out what invertebrate life they're attracting, but it's that base food source that just brings in further life. Of course, the only issue with this is that it's a fenced enclosure, so it's limited to some extent, but it's still quite a good example for the community to show it in action. Next slide, please. And it's not just the farming community and anglers who we're bringing along. Young people as well have been really taken by this. So it's what we've found about the beaver reintroduction. Kids are learning a lot more at the moment about the threats that the climate breakdown are bringing to us locally, not just on a global level, but locally, and the impacts of the biodiversity crisis are bringing locally as well. And beavers have been a really positive way to talk to young people about this and to say that, you know, if we bring beavers back on a catchment scale, you can help us with some tree planting that they've started doing themselves, actually, a lot of the local community, which is lovely. If we bring beavers back, they can help us toward our targets to mitigating the impacts of climate change locally. And you can be involved in this. So it's been really lovely seeing the responses of children to this and having it as a way to speak to them in a positive kind of forward future thinking way, as opposed to just the concerns that are associated with the climate crisis. It's something that they can look forward to and come and see in action. Next slide, please. But when it came to the consultation, of course, I had to halt all consultation because we couldn't go into village halls, which was the initial plan with COVID. So we took it online, Zoom. Zoom has been absolutely brilliant this past year. I'm sure most of you who work in community engagement will agree how vital it's been. But for us, it's meant that I've been able to speak directly with just under 2,000 people about beavers now who have come on talks. This is 20 plus talks. It's about 35 talks I've given about the beavers online now. So having that direct engagement, face-to-face still, even though it's on a screen, face-to-face engagement has been really important. So I've spoken with naturalist groups, local farmer facilitation networks. We're working on the anglers. We're still speaking with the local angling societies and groups, and we're getting them out onto site. And of course, the local community as well, which hopefully we anticipate will actually back the beavers up when it comes to their intended free living distribution on our local rivers. As well as that, where I couldn't bring people onto the site, we created just a few short kind of videos just made and edited on my phone. But again, it was a lovely way to actually bring people on that journey with us to see the changes that the beavers were making, where they couldn't come with us in person. They got to be part of that initial transition of the habitats. And they got to feel the excitement, because what's really important in these videos is to genuinely show the excitement that I feel taking them along on that journey. And again, people have responded quite well to that. Twitter, we set up a social media account at Cumbria Beavers, just on Twitter. And of course, we're featured in local radio. There's Knowing Me, Knowing You, if any Alan Partridge fans are out there, which is a BBC Cumbria weekly edition now, which I'm very thrilled with. Partner magazines as well to get it out to the nature's advocates that are already in existence, like Cumbria Wildlife Trust and RSPB, and newspapers too. Next slide, please. So the key feedback, as Alan said, speaking with the community as soon as possible has been so important to kind of scope the issues that we might face and we're very likely to face if beavers are to be free living. So just some of the key feedback that I've had for those who might be interested. Farmers are very concerned, understandably, about who's going to be on the ground to mitigate impacts. It's a question that we all need to find a solution to answer. How will these be funded? Will it be through the ELM scheme? And most importantly, the most frequent thing I get asked is, can we come and see them? Can I bring my family to actually come and see them and talk to you in person? So that in-person interaction following on from online engagement is the next step now. Anglers, we're having ongoing discussions. We have actually realised that in our particular region, there's a lot of inaccuracies about beavers, and a lot of those are based on rumours within that particular community. So we're just bringing them out onto site now, having open, honest discussions about the benefits and the difficulties that beavers will likely bring. But getting them out individually has been quite important. So beavers are still a bit of a taboo word within the national park, not in the farming community, but primarily in the angling community. So we're just trying to get it as a bit more of a commonplace discussion and less taboo to talk about. Conservationists have actually been the most anti-beaver group, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase, group that I've spoken with. Lichens, what's going to happen to the rare lichens when the beavers fell the trees? Freshwater pearl mussels, which is something we're working on in Ennerdale. Tree planting, they've been planting trees for years. What if the beavers fell the trees? And there's been a bit of a resistance to kind of general ecosystem change within this group. So again, we've realised that we need to work on our interpretation of showing that beavers are part of the bigger vision of restoring nature, the health and the vibrancy of nature, particularly in the national park, as opposed to managing it in a strict, it will stay the same landscape. And the public, there's a lot of belief that beavers eat fish, that they'll dam large river systems and flood the houses. They're concerned that beavers will be killed if there's deemed to be too many. The public are very concerned that beavers are going to impact farmers because it's a farmed landscape, of course, here. But most of all, the public keep asking, why are we putting the beavers in cages? Why do they need to be in these enclosures? Can we not just have them free living and learn to live alongside them? So again, that's something that we're all working on with DEFRA and Natural England to produce the England Beaver Strategy, which we hope to be introduced in summer this year. Next slide, please. So that's a very, very brief overview of the Lowther reintroduction trial. As Elsie mentioned, through my social enterprise, we're working with the Wild Ennerdale partnership as well, which will reintroduce beavers into around a 6,000 acre area, the entire valley. So that's a really exciting project for England in particular. So if you want to find out more about that, you can visit wildennerdale.co.uk. But otherwise, you're very welcome to get in touch with me after this to find out more about the Cumbria Beaver Group.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Heather. It's brilliant to see the pictures of what they're actually doing on the ground and be able to put, some of what Alan was saying, properly in our mind with the pictures is fantastic. So thank you very much. Before I introduce Scott, who's our last speaker, just a reminder that you can ask the panellists any questions. You can use the Q&A function or the chat function to send us your questions, which we will which we'll get to after Scott has spoken. So Scott Blair, who's going to be our final panellist this afternoon, is an advocate in practice at the Scottish Bar. He has a keen interest and commitment to animal welfare and animal law, both in his legal practice and outside of it. He has a broad range of specialisms in law, which include administrative, public, environmental and human rights law, and he's ranked as band or tier 1 in the legal directories for many of these areas of law in Scotland. And all of this made him the perfect advocate to get on board for the judicial review against Nature Scot, which I've already mentioned at least twice today, and which will be the focus of Scott's presentation to us this afternoon. Thank you, Scott.
Oh, thank you very much. As we say in Scotland, you're swelling my heed with the praise there. I'll hopefully live up to the expectations that you've just created for everyone. Thanks very much, Elsie. I have to say my own personal journey with beavers began about, I suppose, 5 years ago, when my wife and I found ourselves on holiday in Argyll in Kilmartin Glen, and the B&B we were staying with were very keen to point out the Knapdale experiment at that point. The B&B was operated by a couple of real nature enthusiasts, and we headed over in a muggy July evening, 8 o'clock, I remember it still, to catch these elusive beavers, not literally catch them, but just catch sight of them. And we found ourselves in the wood at Knapdale, going up a muddy track at 8 o'clock at night. And I still remember this magical moment of just catching a glimpse of 2 beavers swimming across the loch there, heading towards an absolutely enormous dam that had been created. And the moment lasted a minute, perhaps that. It was a fairly long drive to get there, a fairly long walk up the track to see them. But it was well worth the effort, I have to say. Fantastic creatures, and a real evocation, I suppose, in my mind, of what wild Scotland may have looked like before beavers were sadly eliminated from the Scottish landscape around about 1500 through hunting. So that was a holiday a number of years ago. And then in terms of my involvement in beaver law, if one wants to call it that, I found myself being asked by Alan and Trees for Life to help them in relation to a judicial review of the lethal control of beavers. Now, I want to speak very briefly about the background to all of this, and those among you have noted already that I don't do slides. I'm quite old-fashioned. I just like to talk. I've got an innate distrust of technology. It usually doesn't work for me. So there'll be no slides from me today, but I'm more than happy to take any questions or to follow up with by email if anyone wants to get in touch and discuss any aspects of the case that I can. But broadly, the background was that beavers were given protected status under the Habitats Directive, which of course emanated from the European Union. In turn, because they were given protected status in Scotland by the Scottish ministers, that in turn brought into play the Habitats and Conservation Regulations 1994 as they apply to Scotland. Now, broadly speaking, there are 2 sets of regs that apply in the UK. The Scottish regs and the regs that apply to England and Wales are effectively the same. So much of what I say today about the technical aspect of the law can be assumed to be read across to the English regs as well. But because they're protected species, it's a criminal offence in terms of Regulation 39 of the regs to disturb them deliberately, to take them, and of course to kill them. It's a criminal offence. Now, Nature Scot, who are the conservation agency in Scotland, they used to be called Scottish Natural Heritage. They now have this new title of Nature Scot, are the agency charged under the Natural Heritage Act in Scotland with the licensing of activities in relation to beavers which would otherwise be unlawful. So if you wish to destroy a beaver dam, if you wish to translocate a beaver, If you wish to kill a beaver and not commit a criminal offence, then you need a licence from Nature Scot. And for Nature Scot to grant a licence, there are a number of legal tests that have to be addressed. Essentially, there has to be a purpose recognised by the regulations, and that, in relation to the litigation I was involved in, was granted in terms of licences in relation to serious damage on agricultural land, putting it broadly. The other test is there has to be no satisfactory alternative to the granting of the derogation. So there are really two limbs here. First of all, someone seeking a licence to move or to kill a beaver must demonstrate a purpose that is recognised by the regulations. The second limb of the test is there has to be no satisfactory alternative to the derogation in question. Now, skipping forwards, Trees for Life brought a judicial review in the Court of Session, which is our equivalent in Scotland for non-Scots or non-Scots lawyers among you, effectively of the High Court, the Administrative Court in London. And broadly speaking, the procedures and the principles of public law we apply in Scotland are pretty much the same in Scotland as they are in England and Wales. But of course, part of the background to all of this was Brexit. The litigation started before we ultimately left the European Union in January of this year. And part of the argument became whether and to what extent the fact that we had moved out of the European Union affected the substantive underlying European law. Now, long story short, our argument was that Brexit did not affect the underlying legal structure which is in place, because broadly, both at UK legislative level, but also in terms of legislation from the Scottish Parliament, the substantive principles of European environmental law, which applied pre-Brexit, remained in place post-Brexit. So the EU-UK Withdrawal Act and also the Scottish continuity legislation, nevertheless ensured that, notwithstanding Brexit, these substantive principles remained in place. And that was not an argument which Nature Scot appeared to take any issue with, and indeed the court appeared to accept that European background remains in place. And I think it's fair to say that that will be the view taken throughout UK legal systems in relation to the structure which remains in place. So when I talk about the Habitats Directive, and when I perhaps reference some of the case law from the European Court of Justice, all of that stuff still remains relevant post-Brexit to litigations relating to European protected species after Brexit, including, of course, beavers. Now, why all of that remains important is that the attack taken by Trees for Life in relation to the licensing of the lethal control of beavers rested on a number of arguments firmly rooted in European law. Well, we did have one or two domestic common law arguments as well, but primarily the focus of the case was very much about European law. The way in which Nature Scot went about the licensing of lethal control was interesting. Through a number of documents, some of which were recovered through very diligent FOI work by Alan and the wider team, we were able to establish that Nature Scot operated something called a PAL policy, although they disputed it was a policy, but the word policy was used in at least some of the documentation. And PAL, meaning prime agricultural land, effectively, on the evidence that we put to the court, demonstrated that if a farmer or landowner could show that there was beaver activity on PAL land, it was pretty much a running certainty that a license for lethal control would be granted. And one of the contentions we advanced in the case was that the PAL policy and the practice following on from that policy was unlawful because it effectively prevented Nature Scot from giving individual scrutiny to each and every application for a lethal control licence, and allowed them to simply apply a policy which prevented what we said had to be careful scrutiny of each application for a licence. In other words, if you turned up and you said, by the way, I have beavers on my land, it falls within the definition of PAL, more or less that's all one had to do to secure a licence. The other sub-arguments under this head were, I suppose, related more towards the questions of translocation and genetic diversity. The Scottish ministers, who are distinct from Nature Scot, had issued a statement to the effect that translocation of beavers in Scotland would not be carried out as a matter of policy, but rather would be allowed to develop naturally. Now, Nature Scot operates independently of the Scottish ministers, but it's fair to say that the documentation which we recovered, again under FOI, appear to suggest a reluctance to actively engage with translocation as an alternative to lethal control. And for example, in relation to some of the emails and other communications uncovered via FOI, it became fairly apparent that very little discussion took place between Nature Scot licensing officers and farmers in exploring translocation as an option. And we've already heard a very good example of translocation this afternoon from Heather, plainly in relation to Scottish beavers making their way over the border and landing up in the lovely part of the world in the Lake District. So it does happen, but it is not something which is actively promoted by Nature Scot. So effectively what one had there was a policy which said, in essence, in terms and indeed in practice, that if your land is PAL, all things being more than equal, you get a license to kill beavers, but also in the context of there being no real engagement with Nature Scot in terms of looking at translocation as a satisfactory alternative to lethal control. Now that takes us on to the next meaty legal point here, which is this. And this is a real point of principle where the case, which is still being considered by the judge, hope to have a judgment fairly soon, is this. The argument for the petitioners, Trees for Life, is that even if one could demonstrate a purpose for which a measure of control is needed, one still has to apply the well-established principle of proportionality, which is the general principle of European law, and that all things being equal, lethal control must be a measure of last resort. In other words, Nature Scot to act lawfully in issuing licenses for lethal control must seek to properly eliminate alternatives which are non-lethal. In other words, you cannot have a system which allows Nature Scot to simply pay lip service to non-lethal alternatives such as translocation, and that one must, given the overriding purpose of the Habitats Directive and the regs aiming to maintain and indeed improve the conservation status of a protected species, one must take steps of a non-lethal nature. And it's only where proportionality leads one to the view that the satisfactory alternative is lethal control that such a measure should be authorised. The argument for Nature Scot is that no, once one has established a proper purpose for control of beavers, then it's entirely at the discretion of Nature Scot as to whether or not the measure that is adopted is lethal or non-lethal. Now, that always struck me as a bit of an odd argument, because common sense, I think, tells us that there is a clear qualitative difference between killing an animal and moving it somewhere else as a way of protecting farmland, not least given the broad conservation objectives of the Habitats Directive. There are other arguments which are really quite interesting in the litigation. One is that Nature Scot failed to properly evaluate genetic diversity as part of the maintenance of the conservation status of the species. In other words, they embarked upon a policy of permitting lethal control without examining whether and to what extent this would impact on genetic diversity in the species in question, and indeed the underlying genetic diversity in terms of its fragility or robustness. So that argument was also part of the case. The other argument, which I think is really interesting, and where I think I'd like to think we'll succeed generally, but I'd like to think we'd succeed in particular on this point, is that Nature Scot have never issued reasons for any of their licensing decisions. Now, there are dozens of these licenses out there in terms of lethal control. Licenses were issued to farmers and landowners, and I'll come to speak about those shortly. But none of the documents that we uncovered indicated any kind of reasoning process as to why lethal control was the acceptable outcome. Now, it seemed to us in running this litigation that when one looks at a whole swathe of European case law, including cases from Finland dealing with the lethal control of wolves, which are, of course, a protected species, birds from Malta, birds from Belgium, in fact, Belgian owls, the Belgian owls case featured greatly in this, that all of these cases indicated that whatever else one does in licensing lethal control, you have to give reasons. Now, the argument's really rooted in fundamental European law, which really has this concept of reasoned decision-making as an aspect of the rule of law. Now, what we say is that if Nature Scot has to apply this test of, is there a proper purpose? Is there no satisfactory alternative? And why, if that is the case, lethal control has to be the outcome, then one must provide reasons for that. And the very failure to provide reasons is in itself unlawful. So whether or not the argument about satisfactory alternative, our argument that it must be last resort, or whether the argument from Nature Scot, which is it's one for their discretion, whatever the side of the debate that particular line is drawn upon, one must still provide reasons for the decision. Now, none of these cases, none of the documents provided indicated any kind of reasoned process. And indeed, to set matters quite clearly, Nature Scot defended the petition on a number of grounds, including that there was no duty to provide reasons. And if there was a duty to provide reasons, it only applied to applicants for licenses and not an NGO like Trees for Life. Now, it seemed to us in the legal team that this simply failed to, A, have proper regard to the general duty to give reasons in European law, but secondly, as regards Trees for Life, the Aarhus Convention, of course, does confer on environmental NGOs a pretty broad range of procedural rights, including rights to reasons for decisions. So there's a really interesting argument in here, not just about the principles of law which apply, but also the articulation of why Nature Scot concluded that the licensing of lethal control of beavers was appropriate. I've summarised pretty much what's a fairly dense lot of law. What I would like to do is just to talk very briefly now about the litigation itself and what we're trying to achieve. A number of things. Firstly, we are trying to have the policy of Nature Scot, the PAL policy, and the practices which follow from PAL reduced. The Scottish term, the English term would be quashed, set aside and rendered null and void. Secondly, we are looking to have all licenses granted on the back of that policy set aside as having been granted unlawfully, because Nature Scot haven't properly followed European law and in any event haven't given proper reasons for the decisions. Now, we had the case in the beginning of June, as I recall. We're now towards the end of July. There is no rule of thumb in Scotland about when judges issue their decisions. A working assumption is perhaps 3 months after the hearing. Time is ticking on. Lady Carmichael, who heard the case, it's fair to say, didn't give much away. She's fairly poker-faced, if I can use that in a neutral term and not a pejorative one. But she's a good public lawyer. She understands the issues, and I'm sure she's giving anxious consideration to what is a really important case, because part of the argument for Nature Scot is that there was a degree of support for their position in some English and Welsh litigations relating to birds under the Birds Directive, which appeared on our view to give a greater degree of discretion than we consider they are entitled to exercise. Now, it seems to us that those cases were more than capable of being distinguished, but it also strikes us that one thing that might emerge from this litigation is that there may be scope for a divergence in view as between how the Scottish courts interpret the Habitats Directive and on a view how some of the English judges are interpreting the Habitats Directive. Only time will tell whether that is in truth a point of distinction. What I think it's also fair to say is that the Beavers litigation absolutely encapsulated the conflict that is at the heart of this issue, because not only did we litigate against Nature Scot, the National Farmers Union of Scotland came in as a respondent as well, an interested party, as did Scottish Land and Estates, who represent most or a large part, at least, of Scottish landowning interests. And both of those organisations quite properly became involved and quite properly sought to support Nature Scot's stance on all of this. So the Scottish case, in a sense, encapsulates a lot of the pressures that we've been hearing about today, the impact on land, the concerns of farmers, the concerns of conservationists, the concerns of animal welfare groups, and so on and so forth. So when the decision comes out, and I hope it comes out soon, and plainly I hope you're successful, I'd like to think it will provide a template for consideration of the issues in general, and might be a useful decision to be looked at more widely in a UK context, not just in Scotland. I'm conscious of my time. I'm going to wrap up there. I hope I've given you enough of a flavour of the case to get an idea of what it was about. And obviously, as with the other panellists, I'm more than happy to answer any questions if there are any questions or comments. But thank you very much for listening. I haven't, as I say, prepared slides. I'm more than happy, though, to take up any issues in due course from anyone who might be interested in hearing about what the Finnish wolves case was about, or the Maltese birds case was about, as opposed to hearing my summary of them. But thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Scott. That was a fantastic summary of the case and all of the issues that were involved in it. So yeah, as Scott said, we're hoping that the judgment will arrive in the not too distant future. Perhaps I could start with a question, and do keep putting your questions in the chat and the Q&A. The panelists have been very active in responding to them in writing already, but we'll pick up a few of the particularly pertinent ones shortly as well. But Alan, perhaps I could start with a question to you about, I mean, as Trees for Life were the petitioner, were the claimant in the litigation, what are you? Do you have thoughts on what the sort of and what impact either a negative or positive decision will have on sort of wider conservation or rewilding efforts in Scotland?
Yeah, that's a could be a very wide one, Elsie. I think Scott was just referencing there some of the implications it could have for how law is interpreted. We are concerned about the role of protection across species. So if this feels to us like quite a new approach to interpreting the regulations. In my time with SNH, there was a much more conservative approach to killing, especially a protected species. And this, it's worth remembering, this European protected species is the highest level of protection that there is. So that's a concern that the next time there's a land use wildlife conflict, that this has set something of a precedent. At a time when when nature's in crisis and we're all talking about nature-based solutions, we need to be finding ways to coexist with nature, and particularly with some of our most valuable species. So I hope that we can. I hope that this will kind of surface that debate a bit, partly surface that issue, but also reinforce the law and say actually protection means that, and we need to be pragmatic about where there's conflict and the solutions that we identify. But we also need to look to be progressive with it and to find ways of making things work. And that's probably, without getting into all the other sort of the implications. I guess the other side of it is kind of what I was trying to raise a bit in my talk, is that we hope that in raising these issues, that actually getting them on the surface, we can start to reach across what currently divides us from other stakeholders. Farmers in this case, and to use that relationship and build up better relationships, because it still strikes me that the shared interest that environmentalists and farmers and other land users have in the land and all the investment we make in that emotionally, we really should be on the same page much more than we are.
Yeah, it's great to hear about sort of the impacts, and as you say, we've got fingers crossed for a positive outcome. Heather, is there a plan? Is it expected that the beavers in the Lowther estate will mate? I think you're on mute. Yeah.
I am. It was expected that they might have mated this winter just gone, but there's been no sign of kits just yet. I think they're hoping for kits, and the enclosure is actually licensed for up to 6 beavers, so they could actually have 2 years worth of kits. Okay, and I mean, Alan, you might know a bit about this as well, but in terms of in these kind of enclosures, what happens when there are multi-generations and they start potentially sort of trying to interbreed within their families? That's a big question. Okay. The kind of plan, according to DEFRA, is that you translocate the oldest siblings into a different enclosure. The different enclosures, but we're all just waiting for this England beaver strategy to find out whether, even after the 5-year trial, because it's a 5-year enclosed trial for each of them, whether after that point they can be released into the wild, or whether they'll have to. Well, we don't know what. To be completely honest, that's something that we're all still waiting for. Okay, it's quite a lot of uncertainty. We've got a question here from Sarah, who says,
And are there any other animals in addition to beavers who have such a helpful environmental impact? Maybe that's one, yeah, maybe for Alan or Heather.
Yeah, I think in terms of the missing keystone species from our ecosystem, there are beavers are perhaps the missing ones, the ones that will have the biggest single impact on an entire ecosystem. I think if we were looking for that ecological restoration jigsaw piece, a lot of that will sit in our missing apex predators, which of course introduces a whole new raft of human wildlife interactions and issues around that. But that's what I'd point to as the kind of one of the key drivers that's missing in terms of a faunal input into how our ecosystems operate.
Excellent. I'll pick up quickly also on a question that was put in the Q&A, which Heather's actually already answered, but I think it gives a good opportunity to discuss sort of rewilding in general. So there was a question which said, why is it that so many conservation societies, including the wildlife trusts, want to manage areas as if nature can't manage herself much better than we can? And why do those societies want to preserve areas for one or two rare or endangered species to the detriment of other species? Do they not understand that opening up areas and leaving them alone means an increase in so many species to the benefit of everything? And Alan, I didn't know, maybe you might have something, because obviously Trees for Life is a dedicated rewilding charity, and how does what you're doing interact with some of these more traditional conservation approaches?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's kind of a question about psychology that Sarah's asked there, and how conservation has developed in Britain. And I mean, the word conservation itself is about holding what we have, focusing down on that. And I think that has led to what to us as rewilders feels like a narrow focus, and just holding on to that, and instead of looking at ecosystems as a wider part that sustains all these species. So there's sometimes a wee bit of tension between there's these kind of two traditions of conservation, and rewilders might derogatively refer to that kind of conservation as gardening. And that equally, that sort of traditional conservation might look at rewilding as a bit reckless, and a bit what's the word, a bit too cavalier with some of our rare species. So some of the most corrosive things that the conservation can do to itself is to let that spiral down into a kind of nitpick or a backbiting sort of argument. I think there is scope for both, but ultimately there is no way out of this nature crisis without restoring ecosystems at scale, and that means thinking big, and it means thinking about ecological processes happening in that way, and that's why we think rewilding is an imperative really for nature.
And Heather, I mean, from putting your RSPB hat on for a moment, you know, the RSPB is a kind of, in many ways, a traditional conservation society, but is the kind of the processes within the RSPB moving much more towards the type of stuff that Alan's talking about? Is that something that's happening, or?
I think that we're seen as a little bit rogue at Haweswater, actually, even within the scope of the RSPB. But it is, I think it's still very kind of target focused. So how many of a particular species you're aiming to get in 5 years in a particular site. And it's, in my opinion, it's kind of that mentality that is restrictive of rewilding on sites. Because the brilliant thing about rewilding is you don't know what you're going to get. And we've kind of demonstrated that at Haweswater in our upland regeneration. We've had species return that we didn't expect. And that goes against the traditional kind of conservation target-based focus. It is slightly changing though, and I think that's with support from the public, who are more on board with rewilding as a bit of a sexier concept, I suppose, partly due to the word itself being really evocative and exciting. So I think the more that we continue to use rewilding, the word itself, the more that might influence change in conservation organisations like the RSPB.
Yeah, although I agree with that, Heather, but I'd also say the word rewilding is a problem for some, and I include in the so for instance, we've helped find an organisation called the Scottish Rewilding Alliance. RSPB are an active member of that, which is great. But the kind of big NGOs are wary of it because in some quarters, rewilding is associated with being a threat, with being anti-people, with being anti-traditional land use. And so it's a word, but the definition of that word is still up for grabs for us. And we have therefore stepped into that with the intention of trying to define it and define it around the relationship that we feel people have with nature and have with the land, and something that can respect the traditions that we've inherited from the past, while still allowing progress to be made and allow this ecological restoration to happen. So this is as much, if not more, of a human problem and conundrum than it is an ecological one.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, I might turn to you quickly. There's a question from Debbie in the Q&A, but just in case people haven't seen it, I think it's quite an interesting one, getting your perspective up in Scotland about how the general public feel about the beavers, because it is only in Scotland, and Scotland's the only part of the UK where there are beavers in the wild already, and we've kind of already jumped ahead of what's happening in England in terms of we are seeing the real life impact, and maybe you could talk about sort of general thinking and community reaction up there.
I think it's quite interesting. As I said to Debbie in my reply, one of the really interesting features of the case, quite apart from the legal principle, was the fact that it was a crowd-funded litigation broadly, and that, of course, is a feature of environmental litigation generally in the UK, but it's probably the first example in Scotland of crowd-funded litigation. There have been other crowd-funded JIRs in Scotland, but relating to devolution and political matters rather than conservation issues. And I think that in itself speaks volumes to the level of concern that exists in Scotland. And even just speaking my own circle of family, friends and colleagues, all of them raised collective eyebrows at the notion of, on the one hand, granting the highest level of protection to beavers, and then within a month of so doing, introducing this regime of lethal control of the same species. Now, those are people who are not particularly well informed about environmental matters who expressed those concerns, but they found it very surprising that if that's what protected species meant, that was the outcome. So I think it's fair to say that in terms of civil society in Scotland, out with perhaps farming and landowning interests, there is a real concern about the way in which beavers are being approached. And I think also that feeds into Alan's point that if a precedent is established which allows a fairly loose regime that permits the lethal control of protected species, if it starts with beavers, then to take up the language of the Spanish Civil War, they start with the beavers. Who do they go for next? Which other species are likely to be targeted? So in terms of general population, my reading of it is that those people who are interested in these matters are concerned about what's happening to beavers. That's not necessarily excluding farmers or landowners, many of whom are keen to work with organisations like Trees for Life and to try and achieve outcomes in terms of translocation. So it's not as simple as drawing a line and saying, well, farmers, landowners don't like this sort of thing. Civil society wants to protect beavers, and drawing some kind of sharp line down the middle. I don't think it's quite as clear as that, but in general terms, I would say the litigation was well received in Scotland by those who were concerned about lethal control of beavers, and I think it served to highlight the point that Alan makes about if a precedent is established here, where might it take us in relation to other species that might be reintroduced or are already here.
Excellent, thank you, Scott. It's great to hear. I'm conscious of time. We've got 1 minute until until we're due to finish. So I think we'll call an end to the questions there. But if we didn't get to your question, we will get back to you by email instead. So it just just leaves me to say thank you very much to Al and Heather and Scott. It's been fantastic to hear all of the different experiences of beavers, and all of the different sorry, I've got an alarm going off. Here we go. All of the, just so many different aspects of beavers, from the legal to the sort of the reintroductions and the wider impact that they have on the rewilding movement. And thank you very much to all of our attendees who joined today. We will be sending out an email with the link to the recording, so please do sort of forward that on to anyone else, and I'm sure you'll hear by email as well about sort of our other upcoming webinars, which are all linked to our We Work as a Rewilding charity. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend.